My husband cheated on me, and when I filed for divorce, I found out his lawyer was the woman he'd been sleeping with. My name is Rachel. I was 31 years old, and 6 years earlier, I had walked away from a career I'd worked incredibly hard to build, because I believed my family was worth more than any courtroom victory. I never imagined that same career would end up being the only thing standing between me and losing my son. I married my husband, Brandon, right after law school, back when we were both young and ambitious and completely certain nothing could break what we had. We had a son, Oliver, when I was 25, and somewhere between the sleepless nights and the diaper bags and the quiet decision to put my career on hold, I told myself I was choosing the better path, the path that mattered more in the long run. Brandon worked as a corporate lawyer for a large construction firm, bringing in enough money that my staying home never felt like a financial risk. It felt, for years, like the safest decision I'd ever made. But safety, I've learned, is often just the name we give to things right before they collapse. It started small, the way these things almost always do. Brandon began staying at the office later, first by an hour, then 2, then entire evenings that bled into missed dinners and Oliver already asleep by the time his father walked through the door. He started keeping his phone face down on every surface, angling the screen away from me even during something as mundane as breakfast. When I asked if everything was okay, he'd sigh, rub his temples, and tell me work was simply brutal right now, that I wouldn't understand the pressure he was under. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly that I built entire justifications in my head for things that, looking back, I already knew in my gut were lies. The truth didn't arrive gently. It arrived on an ordinary afternoon, while I was on my knees in the passenger seat of his car, digging under the seat for one of Oliver's missing hair ties, my fingers brushing against a folded piece of paper wedged into the side pocket. A hotel receipt. 2 names on the room. His, and someone else's. I sat in that car for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go back inside the house. When I confronted him that night, laying the receipt flat on our kitchen table between us, I expected him to lie the way he always lied, smooth and immediate. Instead, he just sat there, and something in his silence was somehow worse than any denial could have been. He finally admitted it, quietly, almost clinically, like he was reading off a deposition instead of confessing to destroying our family. He'd been seeing someone for months. Someone from a legal conference. Someone who, in his words, understood the demands of his career in ways I apparently no longer could. I filed for divorce 3 weeks later. I didn't cry when I signed the papers. I think I'd already cried everything out in the days before, alone in the shower where Oliver couldn't hear me. What I didn't expect was how fast Brandon would turn from ashamed to vicious. Within a month of the filing, his legal team submitted a request for full custody of Oliver, citing my 6 years out of the workforce as evidence of instability, painting me, in cold legal language, as a woman incapable of providing for her own son. I remember reading that filing at 2 in the morning, Oliver asleep down the hall, my hands shaking so hard I had to set my phone down twice just to keep reading. The first hearing was scheduled at the county courthouse downtown, a building I hadn't set foot inside since I sat for the bar exam, back when I imagined a completely different future for myself. I arrived early that morning, my folder of notes clutched against my chest, my heels echoing against marble floors I hadn't walked in years. I was sitting on a bench outside the courtroom, going over the timeline my attorney had prepared, when I heard familiar laughter drifting down the hallway. I looked up, and there was Brandon, walking toward the courtroom doors beside a woman in a sharp navy suit, her hand resting on the small of his back with a familiarity that made my stomach drop before my brain even caught up. And then, right before they reached the doors, she leaned in and kissed him. Quick. Casual. The kind of kiss that belongs to people who've done it 100 times before. I sat frozen on that bench, watching the woman who was about to argue for taking my son away from me straighten Brandon's tie with the same hands that had clearly touched him in far more places than a courtroom hallway. The woman representing my husband in our custody battle was the same woman he had cheated on me with. I don't know how long I sat on that bench after they disappeared through the courtroom doors. Long enough that my attorney found me still frozen there, my folder of notes forgotten in my lap, my knuckles white against the edges of the paper. "Rachel," she said, crouching slightly to catch my eyes. "We need to go in." I looked up at her, and something in my voice came out steadier than I felt when I said, "Give me one more minute." Because in that 1 minute, my entire body was recalculating everything I thought I knew about this fight. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. This wasn't just a marriage falling apart. This was a direct, glaring conflict of interest, the kind of ethical violation that could end a career if handled correctly, and Brandon and his mistress had apparently been too consumed with each other to think that far ahead. What neither of them understood, what Brandon himself had spent 8 years quietly forgetting, was that I hadn't just been some housewife who lost herself entirely. I graduated at the very top of our law school class. With honors. While Brandon finished comfortably in the middle, content with being good enough. A professor who'd been genuinely impressed with my thesis on family law had personally recruited me to his firm the moment I passed the bar, and I'd spent a full year there, building real cases, learning the exact kind of courtroom instincts that don't just evaporate the moment you become someone's mother. I hadn't practiced in 6 years. But sitting on that bench, watching Brandon's mistress adjust her blazer before walking in to argue that I wasn't fit to raise my own child, something inside me shifted, hard and fast, from wounded to razor sharp. I stood, smoothed down my blouse, and walked into that courtroom like the version of myself I'd buried under years of laundry and lullabies. Before proceedings even began, I asked the judge for permission to address a matter of professional conduct. Judge Alvarez, an older woman with sharp eyes and zero patience for nonsense, granted it with a single nod. "For the record," I said, my voice steady even as my pulse hammered in my ears, "opposing counsel is engaged in an intimate relationship with my husband. I personally witnessed physical affection between them in this courthouse hallway less than 10 minutes ago. Given that the custody of my son is the subject of this hearing, I believe this constitutes an undeniable conflict of interest." The courtroom went silent in that particular way rooms go silent right before something breaks apart completely. Judge Alvarez called both attorneys forward, and I watched Melissa, the name I learned only that day, go pale in a way no amount of expensive foundation could hide. She tried, at first, to wave it off as an innocent misunderstanding, a friendly gesture between colleagues. But Judge Alvarez wasn't interested in vague reassurances, especially once I calmly laid out exactly what I'd seen, the hand on his back, the kiss, described with the same clinical precision I'd once used building arguments as a young associate. Melissa was disqualified from the case that same afternoon. The hearing was postponed while Brandon scrambled, red-faced and furious, to find new representation on short notice. I remember the exact look on his face as we both walked out of that courtroom. Somewhere between humiliation and disbelief, like some part of him had never truly considered that the woman he left folding laundry at home might still know how to fight. Over the following weeks, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of hiring a replacement attorney, I petitioned the court for permission to represent myself in the custody proceedings, something entirely legal given my standing bar admission, even after years away from active practice. My original attorney warned me against it, told me emotional cases were exactly the kind of cases lawyers should never handle for themselves. But something in me needed to stand in that courtroom not as a grieving wife hoping someone else would fight on her behalf, but as the woman who had earned, through blood and exhaustion and years of quiet sacrifice, the right to fight for her own son with her own 2 hands. I spent the next month relearning family law with an intensity one hadn't felt since finals week in my final year of school. I stayed up long after Oliver fell asleep, surrounded by custody precedents and case files spread across our kitchen table, the same table where Brandon had once confessed everything with that same cold, clinical calm. I built a case, piece by piece, that methodically dismantled every claim he'd made about my instability. Pediatrician appointments I had scheduled and personally attended. School conferences I had never once missed. Years of steady, consistent presence in Oliver's life, built while Brandon logged increasingly long hours with a woman who wasn't his wife. At the final hearing, Brandon's new attorney tried one last angle, arguing that my years outside the workforce left me financially dependent, therefore less capable of providing stability for Oliver's future. I stood, smoothed my blazer, and looked directly at the judge. Financial contribution and parental stability are not the same thing, I said. For 6 years, I built the exact kind of consistent, present caregiving that family courts exist specifically to protect. My legal background may have been dormant, but it was never gone. And it is more than sufficient to support both myself and my son moving forward. Judge Alvarez ruled in my favor. Primary physical custody awarded to me, with Brandon receiving standard visitation. Outside the courthouse, Brandon caught up to me in the parking lot, his voice tight, caught somewhere between anger and something almost like respect. "I didn't know you still had all that in you," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the building behind us. I unlocked my car door, turning to face him one last time. "You never bothered to ask," I said. "You just assumed I disappeared the moment I became someone's mother." He didn't have anything to say to that. I got into my car, and before I even pulled out of the parking lot, I dialed the number for the firm I'd worked at all those years ago, the same professor still listed as senior partner. I left a voicemail asking whether there might be an opening for an attorney ready to return to family law, effective immediately. 3 days later, he called me back himself. "Rachel Whitfield," he said, warmth unmistakable in his voice. "I always wondered when you'd come back." "So did I said, glancing at Oliver's booster seat in the rearview mirror. "Turns out today's the day."